The desert is silent. Not the kind of silence that soothes you, but the kind that watches you back. Sand stretches endlessly, golden and merciless, and somewhere beneath it lie the whispers of a civilization that refused to sleep. The air hums with incense, prayers, and something else. A faint curl of smoke, sweet, strange, and ancient, drifts from the courtyard of a temple older than memory. The Egyptians called it shemshemet asterisk, the sacred plant. We call it cannabis. And long before it became the subject of modern debate and teenage rebellion, it was already shaping rituals, medicine, and the quiet moments between life and death. To understand ancient Egypt, you must forget everything you know about history being sober. Because the truth is, a surprising number of their gods, doctors, and possibly even cats, were a little bit high. Picture this. The year is 1500 BCE. A scribe sits cross-legged beside a papyrus scroll, grinding green buds into fine powder. The temple air is heavy with perfume, lotus, frankincense, and the unmistakable musk of something forbidden yet divine. This wasn't recreation. This was ritual. Cannabis wasn't a drug, it was a bridge. They used it to speak to gods, to treat pain, to enter trances so vivid that the line between vision and hallucination didn't just blur, it danced. In hieroglyphs, the plant appears like a secret signature. It hides between lines of devotion, coded into medical texts and temple offerings. Modern scholars call it coincidence. But the ancients didn't believe in coincidence. Only messages. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, mentions remedies for inflammation, pain, and even sorrow. And tucked between its brittle fibers, the residue of cannabis pollen still clings, as if the plant itself refused to leave the conversation. The high priests burned it in censers, mixing it with myrrh and blue lotus. The smoke rose in swirls toward the ceiling of sandstone temples, like a dialogue between human and God. Imagine standing there, barefoot on the cold limestone, the rhythmic chanting echoing through columns tall enough to make you forget you exist. The priest breathes deeply, eyes half-lidded, and murmurs a prayer that sounds suspiciously like the beginning of a Pink Floyd track. For them, divinity wasn't a sermon. It was an experience. And sometimes, enlightenment came rolled in papyrus. The god Thoth, scribe of the heavens, patron of knowledge, was said to bring wisdom through altered states. Write what the gods whisper, the priests were told. But no one mentioned how loud those whispers could get after a good smoke session in a temple courtyard. And so, beneath the burning sun and the ever-watchful eyes of the Sphinx, Egypt found transcendence, not in silence, but in smoke. The line between medicine and magic was thinner than papyrus. To the Egyptian healer, every illness had a shadow, a curse, a spirit, a whisper in the bloodstream. And cannabis was their quiet ally in the war against the unseen. Ground into oils, it soothed the body. Burned in lamps, it calmed the mind. Mixed with honey and date wine, it made pain dissolve into dreams. Imagine the physicians of Thebes, their linen robes dusted with desert wind, crushing leaves into ointments for swollen joints and weary backs. The workers who built the pyramids, those sun-scorched hands that lifted history stone by stone, were not strangers to this green salvation. It wasn't rebellion. It was survival. A puff after labor, a blessing before sleep. The gods might have demanded monuments, but the workers demanded mercy. In the palace, the story was different. Cleopatra's great-grandmothers, the queens before her lineage, kept jars of perfumed cannabis oil beside their alabaster mirrors. It wasn't called self-care back then, but the effect was the same. A little smoke to ease the nerves, a dab of salve to brighten the skin, a prayer to Hathor, goddess of pleasure, beauty, and that peculiar smile that only comes when you forget your worries for a while. The priests said the gods taught humans to use the plant. The skeptics said the gods used it themselves. In temple art, smoke drifts from altars toward celestial faces, curling like serpents of devotion. Some believed it carried thoughts upward, that prayers clung to it like moths to a flame. Others believed the opposite, that it brought the divine down into mortal lungs. Archaeologists found hemp fibers in tombs, seeds buried with the dead, and traces of the plant in ancient incense burners. These weren't coincidences. Egyptians took their afterlife seriously. Every trinket, oil, and herb had purpose. Cannabis wasn't just medicine for the living. It was comfort for the dead. A final exhale before eternity. When embalmers prepared the pharaohs, they anointed them with cannabis-infused oils, believing it would preserve not only the flesh, but also the spirit's ease in the great beyond. The smell of death was masked by something far older, far kinder. Imagine that. Your final journey beginning not with fear, but with fragrance and a calm, drifting peace. It's easy to forget that in their world, this wasn't taboo. There were no stoners, no laws, no social debates, only seekers, physicians, and dreamers. The Nile flowed, the smoke rose, and the world kept turning under a sun that never blinked. To them, the plant wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. The temple was more than a place of worship. It was a laboratory for the soul. Every scent, every flicker of flame, every note of the sistrum was designed to bend the mind toward eternity. And somewhere between the incense and the chanting, the gods began to whisper. Priests prepared the mixtures carefully, combining myrrh, blue lotus, and ground cannabis resin. The smoke was said to carry voices. Not human ones. Voices that slipped between realms, from desert winds, from the stars, from the gods themselves. As the air thickened, the boundaries of the body thinned. To breathe deeply was to touch divinity. In the temple of Hathor, goddess of music and joy, the rituals blurred the line between ecstasy and devotion. Women played harps, men danced in golden collars, and the air shimmered with heat and perfume. Some believed that the goddess herself descended in these moments, drunk on incense and song. Her laughter rolled through the temple like thunder over the Nile. And the worshippers, eyes wide and glittering, swayed in rhythm, half in this world, half in the next. To the uninitiated, it might have looked like chaos, a fever dream of color and sound. But to those who lived it, it was revelation. They weren't escaping reality. They were expanding it. Each puff of sacred smoke peeled back another layer of illusion, another veil between mortal and God. Even the hieroglyphs seemed to breathe with that hidden knowledge. In seams etched onto temple walls, figures hold plants, bowls, and jars, offerings to gods who already seem half-dazed by the aroma. Modern historians call it symbolism. The ancients would have called it a good evening. And then there were the oracles. Those chosen few who sat alone in darkness, surrounded by rising smoke, eyes rolled to the heavens. They inhaled slowly, waiting for visions to bloom behind their eyelids. Rivers turning to gold, stars melting into the sea, serpents speaking in riddles. They would emerge from the trance trembling, lips whispering prophecies only half understood. Maybe the gods spoke through them. Or maybe they were just too high to tell the difference. But perhaps that was the point. To the Egyptians, Enlightenment wasn't found in logic, it was found in experience. To see the gods, one had to dissolve the self. And if a little smoke could help speed up that process, then the gods surely wouldn't mind. To the Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't distant. It wasn't some faraway heaven or fiery punishment. It was simply the next room. A place you could walk into, if you knew the right words, or smoked the right things. Dreams were sacred to them. Not distractions, but doorways. When a priest or a pharaoh closed their eyes, they didn't see darkness. They saw maps, pathways of stars, rivers of light, gates guarded by creatures that only exist when the mind slips sideways. Cannabis, in the ancient world, wasn't about escape. It was a compass. Artists, too, chased those visions. Scribes who painted gods with falcon heads and suns between their horns didn't think of it as metaphor. They saw these things. In temple chambers filled with smoke, in the heat shimmer above the desert, in the endless hum of insects and drums. Every god, every color, every curve of hieroglyphic script was born from trance and transformation. Imagine an artist in Thebes, sitting cross-legged by the Nile. He mixes pigment with cannabis oil, the scent clinging to his hands. His brush moves slowly, reverently, tracing Anubis across the wall. To him, Anubis isn't myth. He's there, standing just behind him, watching with eyes like twin eclipses. Each stroke is an offering, each breath a prayer. The world around him fades until only the painting remains, glowing like a window into another life. This was the rhythm of Egyptian creation, art as magic, intoxication as inspiration. They didn't fear altered states, they cultivated them. Smoke wasn't sin, it was ceremony. It lifted the spirit, sharpened dreams, and reminded mortals that the divine was never far, only a breath away. Even death was painted with gentleness. The Book of the Dead describes the soul's journey not as punishment, but as passage. The dead woke in fields of green, among rivers that mirrored the Nile. Perhaps that's why cannabis was sealed into their tombs, not as treasure, but as travel gear. A scent to guide the soul, a comfort for the crossing. To die was simply to dream longer, and who wouldn't want to drift into eternity wrapped in warmth and smoke? And so they burned it, for the living, for the dead, for the gods, for themselves. A single flame, a thin line of rising smoke, and a prayer whispered to the stars. Somewhere in that quiet haze, art was born, souls were freed, and history learned to breathe. Egypt didn't separate science from sorcery. To heal the body was to balance the soul. To write a law was to honor a god. And to burn a leaf in silence was not rebellion, it was alignment. Cannabis fit neatly into this philosophy. It wasn't labeled as medicine, magic, or heresy, because it was all three. The same plant could ease a pharaoh's pain, charm a curse, or open a door to the divine. Its use depended not on rules, but on reverence. Priests taught that every substance carried a vibration. Some heavy and grounding, like stone, iron, or death. Others light and ascending, like music, laughter, and smoke. To them, cannabis was the bridge between the two. It floated between worlds, never fully bound to earth or sky. In temple schools, initiates studied how to use it wisely. They learned chants to calm the senses, hymns to steady the heart. They were warned. Do not wander too far. The gods will show you much, but not all is meant to be seen. Still, many wandered anyway. Visions were addictive. So was the feeling of being weightless beneath the gaze of Ra. The moral codes of Egypt, the laws of Ma'at, spoke not of sin, but of balance. Truth, harmony, and order were sacred. So long as the smoke served clarity, not chaos, it was pure. But when used for deceit, the priests said, the gods would twist the dreams of the guilty into nightmares. Even then, punishment was poetic. The Egyptians didn't ban the herb, they warned against misunderstanding it. In the royal courts, debates brewed over more than politics. Philosophers and healers argued whether enlightenment should be earned or induced. One scribe wrote, "The gods gave us eyes, but the smoke gives us sight." Another countered, "If the gods wanted us high, they'd have built the pyramids upside down." The papyrus ends there. We don't know who won the argument. But considering how often incense smoke filled the halls, it's safe to assume everyone forgot what they were debating halfway through. Egypt's genius lay in its acceptance of paradox. They worshipped death but celebrated life. They built eternal tombs yet chased fleeting ecstasies. And through it all, cannabis remained, quiet, fragrant, eternal. Neither forbidden nor glorified. Just understood. Even today, buried deep in tombs sealed by millennia of sand, faint traces of hemp cling to artifacts. Not because of ritual or mistake, but memory. As if the earth itself remembered the nights when humans spoke to gods through smoke. The Egyptians didn't need nightclubs. They had temples, torches, and gods who loved a good beat. Every festival was half prayer, half trance. And when the drums started, the Nile itself seemed to sway. Music wasn't entertainment, it was a ladder. Each note, each clap, each rattle of the sistrum carried the spirit higher. The goddess Hathor ruled over this domain: music, beauty, intoxication. She wasn't worshipped through silence or restraint. She was praised through rhythm, laughter, and the shared pulse of 1,000 hearts beating as one. In festival nights dedicated to her, the air shimmered with heat and incense. Musicians lined the courtyards, women with gold rings in their ears and men with painted eyes. They played harps, drums, and flutes made of reed, the same reeds that grew from the banks of the Nile, whispering secrets in the wind. And when the smoke began to rise, that sweet, earthy scent of burning herbs and cannabis resin, the celebration transformed. Voices grew louder, bodies moved freer. The dancers spun with the rhythm of eternity, hands tracing spirals that mimicked the stars. No one called it getting high. They called it communion. To them, joy wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was sacred. Every smile was a hymn, every sway an offering. They believed that laughter pleased the gods more than fear ever could. Because fear builds temples, but joy fills them. Even pharaohs joined these celebrations. Imagine golden crowns glinting under torchlight, linen robes fluttering, cups of wine laced with lotus and hashish oil passing from hand to hand. Their world wasn't divided into holy and profane. It was all divine, every moment, every inhale. At the heart of these gatherings stood the musicians. They were not mere performers. They were alchemists, turning sound into spirit. Some believed the right chord could summon the gods, others said it could heal the sick. Either way, no one ever left untouched. When dawn came, the fires burned low. The drums softened. The priests chanted slow hymns as the last curls of smoke rose toward the fading stars. It wasn't a hangover. It was a holy silence, that quiet after ecstasy, when even the gods seemed to be catching their breath. Egypt understood something the modern world forgot. Joy itself is sacred. And sometimes, the fastest way to the divine is a song, a breath, and a little smoke curling toward the moon. The pharaohs didn't just rule by decree. They ruled by experience. And part of that experience was smoke. In the chambers of the palace, jars of perfumed oils and crushed herbs waited on alabaster trays. Cannabis was mixed into ointments, incense, and even wine, each preparation carefully calibrated. It wasn't indulgence, it was protocol. The king's body was sacred, but so was his mind. And the mind needed flight. Cleopatra herself, according to whispered tales, used cannabis to sharpen focus before council meetings and to relax after matters of state. She wasn't escaping politics. She was preparing to bend the world. One inhale, and the chaos of intrigue became patterns, webs she could see through. Every enemy, every ally, every minor insult or whispered rumor, suddenly readable like hieroglyphs on a temple wall. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, is rumored to have indulged during his religious reforms. As he shifted Egypt toward the worship of Aten, he burned incense and herbs in rituals meant to open perception. Some modern scholars scoff at the idea. But the temple walls suggest otherwise. Figures dance in swirls of smoke. The sun disk glows like it's laughing. And somewhere beneath it, the pharaoh's mind floats, half in vision, half in policy. Royal physicians documented these effects meticulously. They mixed cannabis with honey, milk, and lotus petals. The resulting oils treated fever, inflammation, and even melancholy. But the doctors knew something the commoner might never guess. The plant could also soothe the mind, sharpen judgment, and heighten intuition. Medicine and magic were the same here. Even power itself carried ritualized intoxication. Before negotiations, treaties, or ceremonial battles, the palace would fill with incense and smoke. The pharaoh would inhale. The advisors would inhale. And suddenly, disputes felt smaller, strategy became poetry, and decisions flowed as if guided by unseen hands. Yet it wasn't merely pragmatic. Cannabis also carried prestige. To use it properly was a sign of wisdom, refinement, and understanding of the subtle forces that govern life. The gods had approved, the priests had blessed, and the pharaoh, whether Akhenaten, Cleopatra, or a lesser-known ruler, merely followed the invisible hand of tradition. By night, the palace transformed. Torches glowed against gold leaf, shadows danced on stone walls, and the faint smell of smoke wove through corridors. Sometimes, the line between ritual and celebration blurred. Perhaps that was the point. To rule a kingdom, one had to understand the divine, and occasionally, that required seeing the world a little differently. Not everyone lived in palaces or temples. Most Egyptians lived closer to the Nile than to the throne, hands scarred from brick, stone, and mud. And yet, even in their simpler lives, cannabis had a presence. Laborers who built the temples and pyramids knew its subtle magic. A quick chew of leaves or a whiff of smoke could ease the back, calm the nerves, and sharpen focus. It wasn't rebellion. It was survival. When you're lifting limestone under a sun that seems intent on melting skin, relief is not luxury, it's necessity. Artisans too, who carved statues and painted frescoes, often kept small bundles of the herb nearby. It opened the mind to patterns and symmetry. They didn't see it as intoxication. They saw it as clarity. Every line etched into stone, every brushstroke on plaster, was informed by a mind gently altered, attuned to rhythm, color, and proportion. Even in marketplaces, the scent of cannabis lingered. It mingled with spices, bread, and the sweet smell of date wine. Traders and farmers passed it along discreetly, a gift, a cure, a reprieve from the heat and dust. No one called it rebellion. No one feared it. It was part of life, as natural as the Nile flowing through their world. Some stories tell of festival workers, waiting for the gods' blessings, sharing smoke as they danced and sang to stave off exhaustion. The air would shimmer with incense and laughter, the sounds of labor giving way to rhythm and joy. Even the lowliest craftsman could feel the sacred pulse of the city in those moments, a reminder that divinity wasn't only in temples or tombs. It was in every breath of smoke and every shared smile. Cannabis wasn't just medicine or ceremony. It was a thread connecting the high priests, the pharaohs, and the common people. A silent witness to life, death, work, and celebration. And though the world outside the palace or temple walls was harsh, for those who inhaled its fragrant smoke, even for a moment, the burden seemed lighter, the horizon wider, and the night a little more infinite. Cannabis wasn't just practical. It was mythical. It appeared in stories whispered from priest to apprentice, etched in scrolls that time itself could barely erase. The Egyptians believed that gods and spirits communicated through altered states. Cannabis was a medium, a bridge between mortal senses and divine perception. Smoke rising from incense burners wasn't merely fragrance. It was language. Every curl carried a message, every inhale a chance to understand truths too subtle for ordinary consciousness. Magical texts mention herbs with strange powers, to heal, to protect, to curse. Cannabis often appears disguised under secret names, wrapped in layers of metaphor and poetry. A scribe might write of a green flame, or a plant of visions, without ever saying what it truly was. Those who knew, knew. Those who didn't would simply marvel at the potency of the magic. In temples, priests used it to invoke visions. They would inhale slowly, chant, and wait. Some saw the Nile flowing backward, stars melting into rivers of light, gods walking among mortals. Others claimed they could hear the whisper of ancestors or the heartbeat of the universe. Whether hallucination or divine revelation, the experience was real to them, vivid, terrifying, ecstatic. Even demons and spirits were subject to its effects. Protective charms, amulets, and spells sometimes included cannabis as a component. It was believed that the smoke could confuse hostile spirits or allow the soul to navigate dangerous realms. In a world where the supernatural was part of everyday life, this little plant became both weapon and shield, medicine and guide. Stories of pharaohs consulting oracles, of priests performing midnight rituals with smoke curling like serpents through columns, all suggest that cannabis was central to their understanding of the cosmos. It wasn't indulgence. It wasn't recreation. It was knowledge. The ancients may have understood something modern people are only beginning to rediscover: that the mind, stretched and softened by smoke, can touch the infinite. Even today, fragments of scrolls and residue in temple artifacts hint at the plant's role. The hieroglyphs don't shout its name. They whisper it. And in those whispers, we hear a civilization that knew the secret, that the divine was never far, especially when carried on the rising tendrils of sacred smoke. Death in ancient Egypt was never final. It was transformation. A transition, a continuation, a journey beyond the visible world. And cannabis was part of the luggage. Embalmers used oils infused with the plant to anoint bodies. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't indulgence. It was preparation. The herbs were believed to soothe the soul, ease the passage, and calm any restless spirits along the way. Tombs were stocked not only with treasures and food, but with fragrant bundles of hemp. Some were burnt as incense. Some were left as offerings. The plant was considered a companion for the journey, a guide through the dark corridors of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Priests chanted as smoke spiraled toward ceilings painted with stars and gods. It was a bridge between worlds, lifting the essence of the deceased and carrying it toward eternity. Cannabis was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Without it, the journey might be long, cold, and confusing. Even commoners took part in these rites. Fragments of tombs reveal traces of the plant in less ornate graves, suggesting that guidance through the afterlife was available to anyone who could grasp it. The divine, they believed, was patient, but it also appreciated preparation. A soul eased by smoke might arrive more quickly at its resting place, or at least enjoy the ride. The Book of the Dead mentions herbs and incense repeatedly. Though it rarely specifies cannabis by name, chemical traces discovered in modern analysis tell a different story. The plant was there, subtly intertwined with prayers, offerings, and spells meant to ensure safe passage. Imagine a priest in a dim chamber, lamp flickering, hands steady, smoke curling upward like a silver ladder. The body rests on the stone slab, wrapped in linen and fragrant oils. The ritual begins. Every inhalation, every prayer, every curl of smoke carries intention. It is protection. It is guidance. It is mercy. In death, as in life, cannabis served its role quietly but powerfully. It was a thread connecting the mundane to the eternal, the living to the departed, humans to gods. A plant, a smoke, a bridge, simple, sacred, unforgettable. The Egyptians didn't only worship seriousness. They worshipped absurdity. Mischief had its place, even among gods who wore crowns taller than mortals could dream. Stories tell of bees, the dwarf god of households and protector of children, who loved a good laugh almost as much as he loved protection. Some legends whisper that he delighted in the fragrant haze of temple incense, sneaking a whiff of cannabis while the priests weren't looking. He would cause minor chaos, tipping over jars, hiding sandals, and nudging cats into mischief, all while the smoke curled lazily above the temple floor. Even Thoth, god of knowledge and scribes, is said to have appreciated altered perception. Scribes writing on papyrus might glimpse impossible patterns, letters rearranging themselves, numbers dancing across the page. Was it divine inspiration? Or the subtle magic of hemp smoke? Perhaps both. Farmers told tales of spirits that wandered the fields, invisible except for the scent of smoke trailing behind them. If you inhaled too deeply, the world shimmered, crops seemed to sing, and the sun bowed lower in respect. It wasn't hallucination. It was education. The spirits were teaching patience, humor, and the sacred importance of noticing small miracles. Even in royal stories, humor had its place. A pharaoh might inhale a puff of incense oil, misplace a scepter, and laugh alongside his courtiers, laughter sanctioned by gods themselves. It was a reminder that power, wisdom, and even divinity were not always solemn. Sometimes, they were absurd. Cannabis, in these tales, was the connective tissue between the serious and the ridiculous. It allowed humans to glimpse a world where gods joked, spirits whispered, and every catastrophe could be softened with a little levity. Smoke didn't just rise to the heavens. It carried laughter. It carried relief. It carried stories. Even today, when we think of Egypt as pyramids, curses, and grave solemnity. We forget this. Their gods had a sense of humor. Their people had ways to join in. And somewhere in the haze of history, the scent of cannabis lingers, a reminder that the divine often prefers to smile rather than frown. Cannabis didn't stay confined to temples or palaces. It traveled along the Nile like a quiet ambassador, weaving through cities, villages, and deserts. Merchants brought it in sacks alongside spices, linen, and gold. Travelers carried it in tiny jars, tucked into belts or hidden in robes. Foreign visitors marveled at its use. Greek historians would later write of Egyptians inhaling fragrant smoke to commune with gods, heal the sick, and sharpen the mind. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others copied it. Markets hummed with the subtle scent of hemp. Farmers growing flax or grain would trade bundles of cannabis to bakers, artisans, and healers. The plant was currency of the senses, a gift, a payment, a token of respect. Even soldiers marching along the Nile carried it. They didn't just need food and water. They needed courage, clarity, and calm. A whiff of sacred smoke before battle or long patrols was more effective than any armor. Cannabis became a silent comrade, as vital as the spear. The spread wasn't random. It followed rivers, trade routes, and the footsteps of priests and pilgrims. Its influence reached not only Egypt's borders, but neighboring lands as well. Philosophers, healers, and travelers carried knowledge of its uses to Nubia, Canaan, and beyond. Even today, scientists studying ancient pollen and resin trace the paths of cannabis across the region. It left a trail like a secret map, showing us not only commerce, but culture, ritual, and the quiet ways humans sought connection to the divine. Cannabis, humble and unassuming, traveled faster than armies or empires. It bridged kings and peasants, priests and travelers, the living and the dead. In smoke, Egypt whispered its stories, and the world listened. The Egyptians didn't separate devotion from delight. To them, the holiest moments were the loudest. Festivals were not quiet affairs of folded hands and whispered prayers. They were explosions of sound, color, and smoke that could shake the sand off the pyramids themselves. Each season brought a new reason to rejoice. The festival of Opet, the feast of Hathor, the flooding of the Nile, all demanded the same offerings: music, wine, dance, and clouds of fragrant smoke. Cannabis wasn't a secret ingredient. It was the pulse of the celebration. The scent carried joy through the air, blurring the line between worship and euphoria. As drums thundered and flutes screamed under the desert sky, crowds filled the streets, thousands of voices rising in unison. Priests led processions of gilded statues through the city, their faces hidden by veils of incense. The air shimmered with heat, perfume, and laughter. And from every corner, smoke curled like serpents, carrying prayers, desires, and half-remembered songs into the heavens. For the Egyptians, pleasure was not a sin. It was sacred acknowledgement of existence. To dance was to honor the rhythm of creation. To laugh was to mirror the joy of the gods. Even intoxication had meaning. It was a rehearsal for eternity, a temporary dissolving of self before the great dissolution that awaited all souls. In these festivals, every person, priest, farmer, noble, beggar, stood equal. The gods didn't care who wore gold and who wore dust. All were invited to dissolve into the same haze of sound and smoke. And as the night deepened, the city became one breathing organism, hearts beating in rhythm, lungs sharing the same fragrant air. When the sun rose, the streets were quiet again. Offerings burned low, Laughter faded into murmurs, and the gods returned to their shrines. But the feeling lingered, that floating, sacred afterglow that made even the most skeptical believer whisper, perhaps the gods were here after all. And perhaps they were. After all, what better invitation to the divine than a city united in joy, in rhythm, in the slow, sweet curl of sacred smoke under the Egyptian stars? Nothing lasts forever. Not even smoke. As Egypt changed, so did its gods. The world moved, dynasties rose and fell, and what was once sacred began to fade into superstition. The rituals that once filled the air with laughter and incense slowly quieted. New rulers brought new laws. New priests brought new prayers. And the old gods, those who danced, sang, and smiled through haze, began to retreat into myth. By the time the Greeks arrived, the language of Egypt had already shifted. Temples were still standing, but their echoes felt distant, foreign. Incense still burned, but its recipes had changed. The sacred herbs were replaced by foreign mixtures, and the old chants lost their rhythm. The gods of smoke became memories, trapped in carvings and dreams. When Rome came, the silence deepened. Pragmatism replaced mysticism. Medicine became science. Magic became myth. Cannabis, once the quiet bridge between body and spirit, was reduced to curiosity. It was tolerated, sometimes forgotten, rarely honored. And then came the desert winds. Centuries of sand swallowed the old temples, the papyrus scrolls, the fields, the altars. The Nile kept flowing, but the songs changed. The gods who once laughed through clouds of smoke were now carved only in stone, mute, patient, watching. The plant, however, refused to vanish completely. Seeds lay dormant in soil and story. A whisper here, a folk remedy there. Farmers still grew it quietly, healers still used it discreetly, and dreamers, there are always dreamers, still followed the scent of something ancient, something divine. It is the nature of smoke to vanish, and yet to linger. Egypt's old ceremonies dissolved into the air, but the idea that the divine could be found through breath, rhythm, and surrender, never left. It drifted onward, through time, through empires, until it reached us. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is still, and a thin trail of smoke curls upward toward the ceiling, perhaps the old gods are watching again. Not angry. Not jealous. Just remembering. History has a strange sense of humor. It buries what matters most, then watches as we dig it up again and call it a revelation. For centuries, Egypt's relationship with cannabis slept beneath the sand, forgotten by scholars, erased by conquest, dismissed as myth. And yet, like the plant itself, it grew in secret places. It waited. Because ideas, like seeds, never really die. They just wait for the right light. When archaeologists began unearthing temples and tombs, they found traces of something unexpected. Sticky residues inside jars, faint chemical fingerprints of cannabis mixed with oils and resins. Science confirmed what myth had always whispered: the smoke wasn't metaphor. It was memory. Every curl of incense had been a literal bridge between this world and the next. The rediscovery was less about the plant and more about perspective. We began to understand what the ancients already knew: that altered states weren't always escape, that intoxication could also mean illumination. That sometimes, to see clearly, you must let the edges of reality blur. Modern medicine calls it pain relief. Spiritual seekers call it awakening. Artists call it inspiration. The Egyptians had a simpler word for it: balance. They didn't worship the plant itself, but the harmony it created between mind, body, and the unseen. In a way, we're returning to that idea now. As laws soften and minds open, we're relearning what ancient hands already practiced under desert suns. That smoke can heal, connect, and remind us of our own small place in the vast machinery of existence. Somewhere, in the invisible corridors of time, maybe Hathor is smiling again. Maybe Thoth nods approvingly. And maybe, just maybe, the gods who once spoke through smoke are clearing their throats, ready to whisper again. We like to think we're so different from the ancients. We have machines that speak, screens that glow, and knowledge that stretches past the stars. But the truth? We're still just creatures chasing warmth in the dark. Still searching for the same thing the Egyptians reached for when they lit their first bowl of sacred smoke: meaning. They looked to the heavens and called it divinity. We look to the sky and call it data. Same gaze. Different vocabulary. What cannabis represented to them wasn't rebellion, or indulgence, or even medicine. It was permission. Permission to feel connected. Permission to slow down the endless noise of existence and listen to the heartbeat underneath. In their rituals, smoke was a language. Every curl said what words couldn't. That life is temporary, that beauty fades, that nothing truly ends, it just changes form. Ashes become earth. Earth becomes life. Life becomes memory. And memory, if told well enough, becomes history. Maybe that's why the story matters. Not because of the plant itself, but because of what it reveals about us. Every civilization has found a way to reach beyond itself, through prayer, through music, through breath, through smoke. Cannabis was just one of many doorways. But Egypt built a temple around that doorway. They turned the act of breathing into an act of worship. And in some small way, when we light a joint today and stare into the quiet of the night, we're not escaping anything. We're participating in something ancient, a ritual older than language, older than empire. It's the same smoke, rising through the same stars, whispering the same message. Remember where you came from. History never really ends. It just goes quiet, waiting for someone curious enough to listen again. Somewhere beneath the dunes, there are still sealed jars, still unburned offerings, still whispers of the old world preserved in dust. If you pressed your ear against the sand long enough, maybe you'd hear them: the laughter from temple courtyards, the music, the soft cough of someone taking a deep hit before offering their smoke to the gods. Cannabis in ancient Egypt wasn't rebellion. It wasn't sin. It was a bridge, between the sacred and the simple, between the eternal and the everyday. A reminder that divinity doesn't always live in lightning bolts or thunderous commands. Sometimes, it's just the quiet, dizzy joy of being alive for another sunrise. The smoke has long since cleared, but the message lingers. Humans have always searched for meaning in the smallest of things, in seeds, in songs, in stories. And maybe, that's what makes us divine. So, the next time you spark something up and stare at the ceiling, remember, you're continuing a ritual older than empire, older than time. The gods might be gone, but the feeling? That warm hum between body and soul? That's eternal. And if you've enjoyed wandering through the haze of history tonight, don't let the story end here. Subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. Because there's always another mystery, another forgotten ritual, another midnight truth waiting to be told. I'm the sleepless voice that digs up the past so you don't have to. And somewhere out there, in the dark, history is still awake. See you in the next dream.